In the previous video, Who Owns Truth Today, Part 1, we traced how truth lost its innocence, how Nietzsche unmasked it as illusion, Derrida unbound its meaning, and Baudrillard watched it dissolve into spectacle. But we ended with a question still burning. If truth no longer mirrors reality, who operates its machinery now? This second part turns from theory to architecture, from philosophy to infrastructure. Because in our age, belief itself has been engineered. The rituals once performed in temples now unfold on timelines. Confession, faith, salvation, recoded as posts, feeds, and metrics. The will to truth didn't die, it migrated online. And there, inside the glowing logic of the algorithm, it found a new god, visibility. If this question speaks to you, stay with this channel. Subscribe, share this video, and let these ideas circulate, because every shared reflection becomes part of the world it tries to understand. So, let's begin where faith and data finally meet, inside the digital religion of truth. Nietzsche once wrote that the will to truth is the last form of faith left to modernity. After the death of God, humanity did not lose its need to believe, it simply relocated that belief. We no longer kneel before revelation, we refresh our feeds. At first glance, this looks like emancipation, truth decentralized, accessible, democratized. But what if the structure of faith, confession, ritual, salvation, never vanished at all? What if it simply changed its architecture? 1. The architecture of digital faith. Michel Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, described confession as the moment when power meets truth. The obligation to confess is now relayed through so many different points. It is imposed by the family, by relationships, by the medical profession, by education. Today, that obligation has become voluntary, continuous, and algorithmic. Every post is a confession. Here is what I think: eat, feel, desire. I unpack this mechanism in my Foucault video, Confession as a Technology of the Self, where we produce ourselves as bearers of truth. The platform does not demand it, it seduces it. We perform our interiority, to be seen, to exist. For Foucault, confession is not only revelation, it is a technology of the self, a ritual through which the subject produces itself as a bearer of truth. Social media universalizes this technology. Everyone becomes both penitent and witness, author and archive. Each like is a micro-benediction. Each share a ritual of communion. The feed is not a window. It is a liturgy, updated by the second. We scroll not to find truth, but to remain within its presence, the warm glow of collective attention. Byung-Chul Han calls this digital devotion. Today, everyone is his own priest and his own congregation. In The Swarm, 2013. The self has become the chapel, the algorithm, the oracle. We pray not for meaning, but for visibility. We crave not transcendence, but recognition. For Han, this is devotion without distance, a faith flattened into transparency, where the sacred no longer hides, but demands to be seen. 2. The sacraments of visibility. In traditional religion, the sacred was marked by distance, the inaccessibility of the divine. Now, sacredness is marked by ubiquity, that which cannot stop appearing. The influencer, the pundit, the activist, each is a preacher in the algorithmic church, measuring grace in engagement metrics. Lyotard's incredulity toward meta-narratives has not eliminated belief, it has multiplied micro-creeds, fragments of discourse competing for legitimacy within their own language games. Communities coalesce around shared enemies, hashtags, or moods, each with its own doctrine, its own heresies. Where theology once debated truth, we now debate authenticity. And authenticity, as Baudrillard warned, has become a code of recognition, a style we repeat to signal sincerity. I explore this in my Baudrillard video, how authenticity turns into a code, a repeatable style that certifies reality by performance. What makes a post true is not its content, but its confessional rhythm, the right mixture of vulnerability, outrage, and polish. A ritual aesthetic. We say speak your truth, but mean perform it compellingly. 3. The priesthood of algorithms. If every user is a believer, then who is the priest? The algorithm, invisible, omniscient, unaccountable. It does not promise salvation, it promises relevance. And relevance, in the new faith, is grace. The algorithm rewards our devotion with visibility and punishes absence with silence. It hears every prayer, but answers statistically. Foucault would call this a new pastoral power, not the shepherd of souls, but the shepherd of data. He wrote, "Power is exercised rather than possessed. It is not an institution and not a structure. It is a name given to a complex strategic situation." The History of Sexuality, 1976. In that sense, the algorithm is the purest form of pastoralism. It does not coerce, it guides. It knows our habits better than we do. It forgives instantly, corrects gently, forgets nothing. But unlike the traditional pastor, the algorithm produces self-shepherding subjects, believers who monitor, optimize, and confess without command. Pastoral care has become self-surveillance, devotion rendered as data maintenance. 4. The persistence of belief. Nietzsche foresaw this paradox. The faith in truth begins when faith in God ends. The Gay Science, section 344. We did not outgrow religion, we internalized it. The will to truth became the will to visibility. We confess, curate, optimize, all in pursuit of a digital afterlife, where nothing truly dies, only circulates. But this new faith carries an ancient danger. Every religion, Nietzsche warned, hides a metaphysics of obedience. In the digital one, obedience takes the form of alignment. Align your tone, your timing, your hashtags. To be seen is to conform. The cost of visibility is sameness. The will to truth mutates into the will to algorithmic harmony, a moral economy measured in engagement rather than virtue. I trace the roots of this shift in my Nietzsche video, Truth, as a useful fiction that survives by the forms that keep it alive. 5. A philosophy of reverence and resistance. How do we live meaningfully inside this new cathedral? Not by renouncing it, there is no outside, but by practicing a philosophical reverence without worship, seeing the sacred in communication itself, not in its idols, to post consciously, to interpret mercifully, to pause. These become acts of resistance, small gestures of care within a machinery of exposure. As Gianni Vattimo suggests in After Christianity, the death of God is not the death of the divine, but its dissemination. Perhaps that is the promise hidden within this new faith, that even in the algorithmic church, meaning can still appear not as commandment, but as connection. Vattimo's weak thought offers precisely this, a faith without fanaticism, a softened transcendence fit for plural worlds, where communication replaces revelation and interpretation becomes the new form of grace. Because every religion, even this one, begins with the same gesture, a voice calling into the void, hoping someone somewhere will hear. Foucault once wrote that truth is of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint. In the 20th century, those constraints were universities, courts, laboratories. In the 21st, they are algorithms. Truth has always been institutional, but never so invisible. We no longer appeal to a sovereign voice, but to a calculation. And the new oracle does not speak, it sorts. 1. The logic of calculation. An algorithm is not a mind, nor a will. It is a grammar of selection. It decides what becomes visible not by judging content, but by measuring correlation, what is clicked, shared, repeated, reacted to. As Derrida might say, it is a writing without an author, a machinic form of difference, endlessly deferring meaning through data relations. I break this down in my Derrida video, meaning that never lands once and for all, but circulates through signs and delays. Yet here, difference is reduced to its shadow, a pattern of delay without depth, an endless recombination without interpretation. We are used to thinking of power as vertical, a state, a CEO, a sensor. But algorithmic power is horizontal, ambient, participatory. It doesn't forbid, it predicts. It replaces prohibition with preference. The result is a new epistemology, truth as feedback. Power and knowledge directly imply one another. Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, 1975. In our time, knowledge has become computation, and power circulates through ranking, recommendation, and reach. What appears most often begins to feel most true. Visibility replaces verification, the probable replaces the plausible. Truth becomes a metric of attention. 2. The rise of procedural truth. The philosopher Matteo Pasquinelli calls this knowledge in the age of machine learning. Truth not as correspondence, but as statistical adequacy. A model is considered true if it predicts correctly, not if it describes accurately. That shift, subtle yet enormous, defines our digital epistemology. Truth is not discovered, it is trained. But prediction accuracy is not semantic depth. A neural model can anticipate behavior without understanding it. This is the difference between knowing how something happens and knowing what it means. As I argued earlier with Nietzsche, truths survive as useful fictions. Today, this survival is automated. Only now, the forgetting is automated. The algorithm remembers everything, except its own bias. Its truths emerge from what has already been rewarded. The world becomes a loop of its own probabilities. And in that feedback loop, Derrida's difference turns concrete. Meaning slides, context mutates, and the center, the real, is nowhere. An AI summarizer, a trending page, a recommender feed. All perform the same act of difference. They defer the original, multiplying its traces until originality itself becomes undecidable. But unlike textual difference, which opens space for interpretation, algorithmic difference closes it, fixing meaning inside the logic of optimization. 3. The genealogy of algorithmic power. Foucault called such systems regimes of truth, networks that define what counts as knowledge. In the algorithmic regime, verification is outsourced to behavior. If people engage, it must be relevant. If they disengage, it disappears. But relevance is not meaning. It is a metric of resonance, the echo chamber as epistemic factory. Baudrillard warned that this is how the simulacrum completes its evolution. Information devours its own content. Simulacra and Simulation, 1981. The map no longer mirrors the territory, it creates it. An algorithmic feed does not reveal the world, it manufactures one that fits the parameters of attention. Each of us now lives inside a probabilistic micro-reality, a bespoke truth system calibrated to taste. Deleuze foresaw this when he wrote of societies of control. Enclosures are molds, but controls are modulations, 1990. The algorithm does not confine, it tunes. It modulates our field of view until difference itself becomes gradient. For Deleuze, such modulation is not mere governance, but ontological engineering, power operating through variation rather than prohibition. Freedom remains, but always within the curve of optimization. 4. The ethics of curation. What kind of world is produced by systems that curate reality? A world where prediction precedes judgment. where we know what will trend before we know whether it matters. A world that replaces debate with design. The task of philosophy, then, is not to demonize the algorithm, but to ask what kind of truth regime it installs. Does it deepen reflection or accelerate reaction? Does it enlarge meaning or compress it into metrics? And what does it do to our capacity for error, that sacred space where thinking begins? Nietzsche might have smiled at this irony. The will to truth has finally achieved perfection, a mechanism that produces certainty without belief. But he would have warned, as always, beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become one. Beyond Good and Evil, section 146. If we delegate discernment to machines, we may gain efficiency, but we risk losing the pathos of truth, the human capacity to care that something is true. For Nietzsche, this pathos was the heartbeat of philosophy, the tension between creation and honesty, between art and conscience. Without it, truth ceases to wound and therefore ceases to awaken. So yes, algorithms now decide what becomes true, but that decision is neither evil nor neutral. It is a mirror of us, our habits, fears, and appetites rendered executable. And perhaps the deeper question is not whether algorithms can tell truth, but whether we can still recognize it once it arrives already optimized. Because from here, only one question remains: can truth survive in the digital age? Truth will survive, but not as we once knew it. It will survive not as mirror, but as gesture, not as discovery, but as creation. Nietzsche saw this coming long before the first machine learned to predict us. We have art, lest we perish of the truth. The Will to Power, section 822. He meant that truth can no longer be a possession. It must become a practice, a way of shaping chaos into meaning without pretending that meaning was ever given. Art, for Nietzsche, is not escape from truth, but its transformation, the creative excess through which life affirms itself against nihilism. When the metaphysical sun sets, the responsibility for illumination falls to us. Through Derrida, this becomes an ethics. Meaning is never present, always in process. To live after the death of absolute truth is to accept difference, the movement of interpretation as the only ground left. It is not relativism, but responsibility, the obligation to read and to respond, to sustain meaning precisely where it cannot be fixed. Truth does not vanish. It vibrates between perspectives, demanding not belief, but attentiveness. Foucault teaches us that truth is always produced, that knowledge is not the enemy of power, but its expression. To know this is not despair, it is lucidity, because if truth is produced, it can be reproduced differently. Power is not the end of freedom, but its condition. Every regime of truth also contains the potential to generate new ones. Awareness becomes the first act of resistance. Baudrillard warned that our era would drown in images, and yet he also implied that reading those images, learning to see their codes, is the new literacy of survival. He wrote, "The real is produced from miniaturized units, from matrices, memory banks, and command models." This is not a death sentence for truth. It is a call to learn a new syntax, the grammar of simulation, to interpret, no longer as exposure of illusion, but as composition of meaning within the illusion itself. So, can truth survive in the digital age? Yes, but only as interpretation with conscience. Only as a practice of care, a willingness to hold uncertainty without collapsing into cynicism. In this sense, the philosopher and the coder now share a task: to decide which illusions will serve life, and which will merely reproduce obedience. Gianni Vattimo calls this weak thought, not as frailty, but as gentleness, a truth that no longer dominates, but listens. For Vatimo, this weakness is hermeneutic strength, a truth humble enough to coexist with other truths. It is perhaps the first ethic adequate to the digital condition, because in a world of endless noise, the rarest strength is the capacity to listen, interpret, and still mean. Nietzsche once dreamed of free spirits, those who could live without metaphysical guarantees and yet still say yes to life. Maybe the digital age, for all its illusions, is the final test of that freedom. If truth now depends on the systems we build, then every act of interpretation, every line of code, every story told, is already a philosophical choice. The question, who owns truth today, leads inevitably to a mirror. We do. And perhaps the last word belongs again to Nietzsche, not as a prophecy, but as an invitation. Become who you are. The Gay Science, section 270. Because after truth, what remains is meaning, and meaning is not found, it is made. Every time we choose to read more deeply, to question what seems self-evident, to create without claiming to possess, truth lives again, briefly, fiercely, as the spark between interpretation and care, a fragile light we keep alive by the act of understanding itself. If you've made it this far, perhaps you already know that truth was never a fortress, but a mirror that changes with every face that looks into it. Each generation inherits the same anxiety, that truth is slipping away, that meaning has become too fluid, too uncertain. But maybe what we call the end of truth is only the end of our comfort with certainty. And perhaps that discomfort, this restless questioning, is the most honest thing we've ever felt. Philosophy doesn't save truth, it keeps it alive. It protects its movement, its fragility, its risk, its refusal to stand still. As Derrida once wrote, to deconstruct is to learn how to live, finally. And to live in a post-truth world means precisely that. To learn to read without illusions, to speak without idols, to keep searching, even when there is no promise of arrival. For Derrida, this is not despair, but ethics, the courage to think when every foundation trembles. Maybe truth was never meant to be possessed. Maybe it survives only when it passes through us, when we interpret, when we doubt, when we create. Every sentence, every post, every act of attention is a rehearsal for meaning, in a world that runs on mirrors. So if something in this video stayed with you, not a statement, but a question, then philosophy has already done its work. Because truth is not what ends a conversation, it's what begins one. In the next videos, we'll continue that conversation. With Derrida, who shows why meaning always escapes us. With Foucault, who reveals how power shapes our truths. And with Baudrillard, who asks whether reality can survive its own reflection. Together, they form not an answer, but a compass, for anyone who still believes that thinking deeply is an act of freedom. Until then, keep questioning. Because every question you keep alive is already a form of truth, not as possession, but as practice, not as certainty, but as care.